Formula One is a sport whose motto must be innovate or die. That mantra means that the top category of motorsport must always renew itself to remain the elite category of motorsport, the pinnacle of driving, technology, and technique. And it's normal for this sport to drastically change its rules constantly over time. However, there have been numerous occasions in the history of Formula One where innovation has been very detrimental to the category, and several times it has come close to that mantra of die trying. It's not unusual for the top motorsport category to have changed so much. A technical regulation that has only ended up causing controversy, generating political fights between the teams, the category, and the fans. And on more than one occasion, the rule changes have sparked a wave of criticism and scandals that definitely haven't left anyone indifferent. Something that, in fact, we're experiencing in 2021. A certain rule change that has pitted teams, drivers, and fans against each other, but which, throughout history, has happened more than once. So, in honor of the dark history of this sport, in this video we're going to count down the top 5 most controversial technical regulations that have been seen in the history of Formula One. Regulations that have put Formula One in the eye of the storm for different reasons, and that, one way or another, have been hard pills to swallow for a category that is constantly changing. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the top 5 most controversial technical regulations in the history of Formula One. Formula One has always meant risk, because one way or another we're talking about a sport where drivers put their lives in danger to compete at over 300 kilometers per hour with the risk of a potential accident at any moment. So safety should never be taken lightly and should always be the priority, the eye of the hurricane, circumstances that have been hard to digest in other ways. This top. It was a change for the sake of safety, driven by the FIA, which triggered a massive wave of criticism among fans and some Formula One drivers. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of this entry is about the introduction of the Halo safety device. An attachment that arrived in the top category of motorsport in 2018, but whose conception, at the time, caused a lot of headaches for the Motorsport Federation itself. The conception of this technical regulation, introduced in 2018, originated from the dangerous nature of open cockpit cars, because before the introduction of this device, no matter how safe the cockpits of Formula One single-seaters were, its major weakness was that the cockpit where the driver was seated was completely exposed, so drivers were always at risk of potentially catastrophic accidents if an object was launched toward them or if they had an accident where a car went flying. And throughout history, many examples of fatalities have occurred, such as the accident of Henry Surtees in 2019 in Formula 2, which ended his life, the accident of Felipe Massa with a spring at the Hungarian Grand Prix in 2009, or the accident of Justin Wilson in 2018.
19. Esto en la categoría indicar cuando una pieza de otro auto golpeó su casco acabando con su vida. ¿Y cómo?
Also, in 2014, the accident of Jules Bianchi, who unfortunately also lost his life when his car crashed into a crane at the Suzuka circuit, as his head suffered a very serious impact with this vehicle. Given the magnitude of the problem, and since it was a weakness that clearly increased the risk of drivers suffering severe injuries, the FIA, which was led at that time, started looking for ways to protect single-seaters, especially the vulnerable area around the driver's head in formula cars. They even investigated systems like partially closed cockpits and aero screens that covered the front part of the car. And one of those investigations led to a ring-shaped protection system that would cover the entire head section, with an upper ring. But that would also have a bar in the middle to block the front part of it. Being a titanium structure, the FIA began testing it with different impact tests, where in those tests, it proved capable of stopping moving objects of considerable size and was critical when it came to collisions with other cars. After passing all tests and proving effective in simulations, Formula One decided that for the 2018 season, all Formula One cars had to carry these structures on every car. And that's where the controversy over this device ended up exploding. The FIA expected a positive reception for this device, but instead faced a wave of criticism from fans and some drivers and members of Formula One who said that this new device went against the essence of Formula car competitions. Some fans began saying this device was going to kill Formula One by covering the cockpit of the cars, which have historically always been open, while some drivers rejected the device saying it went against the DNA of Formula One. Well, even though some drivers approved of the device, others criticized it harshly, as Hamilton, Verstappen, Hülkenberg, Niki Lauda, and a small group of other drivers did at the time, who didn't seem thrilled about having this protection over their heads. The criticism was about how visually unappealing the device was, and that it could be very dangerous in case of a fire if a driver needed to get out of the car quickly, because the time it would take for a driver to exit with this device would increase drastically. And there were also complaints about the limitations to visibility that this device could cause, or if a driver had to be removed from their car in an emergency, the time it would take for a track marshal to carry out the extraction. However, despite the flood of criticism that the category started to receive, the FIA did not back down from this regulation. They withstood each and every criticism that started to pour in, and later on, they even made it mandatory for other lower categories to also install these devices. Which in fact, year after year, has proven to be a huge success by the International Automobile Federation, since on more than one occasion, this device has ended up saving lives. For example, at the start of the 2018 Belgian Grand Prix, with the accident that Romain Grosjean had in 2020 at the Bahrain circuit, or with the crash that Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen had at the 2021 Italian Grand Prix. This obviously calmed most of the criticism directed at this device, since people and drivers began to accept it after it clearly demonstrated its usefulness in creating better safety conditions for the drivers. But the huge media stir caused by the implementation of this device, the criticism it received, and the little initial acceptance it had at the time, the Halo device, among fans and some drivers, puts the 2018 technical regulations with the introduction of the Halo at number 5 on our list. Some years ago, more than some fans would like to admit, Formula One was synonymous with heavy, powerful, and above all, extremely loud engines. For the old guard of Formula One, the sound produced by the V10 or V8 engines from the early 2000s is an almost indescribable sensation. However, the technical regulation in 4th place in this ranking is one that not only brought a revolutionary change to Formula One, but also eliminated the characteristic deafening noise that is anteriormente los autos de Fórmula 1. And gentlemen, the story of the 4th place in this ranking is the technical regulation from 2014, which introduced hybrid power units to Formula One, which even today are still heavily criticized for their complexity and for being not very appealing to the public. But to tell this story, first we have to go back to the year 2011. In this year, the heart of Formula One cars was still the naturally aspirated 8-cylinder engines which were known for being. However, in the world, hybrid technologies were starting to become the trend as manufacturers wanted to give the world more efficient and environmentally friendly cars than the options that were available on the market at that time with combustion engines. And manufacturers like Mercedes or Renault were putting a lot of pressure on Formula One to change the direction of the power units that existed at that time, even threatening to leave Formula One if hybrid technologies were not adopted.
En sus unidades de potencia.
Seeing the change in trend, the International Automobile Federation between 2010 and 2011 began to develop a new technical regulation to favor Formula One manufacturers in light of the shift in the automotive trend. Although since 2009 the category had already begun experimenting with the implementation of a system called KERS, which stands for Kinetic Energy Recovery System, which in essence was a hybrid system that generated electric power through recovery, energy that was delivered in. It was a small step, but the constructors believed it wasn't enough, so by 2014 a huge change began to be considered. Basically replacing the naturally aspirated V8 engines with 1.6-liter turbocharged V4 hybrid engines, and whose power would be distributed as 80% from combustion and 20% from electric energy through components like the MGUK, the MGUH, and the batteries. However, this technical regulation, from its inception, began to be heavily criticized by some manufacturers. For example, Ferrari said that these power units with V4 engines were absolutely useless to them and they couldn't implement them in their supercars. And under pressure, they ended up opting for a V6 engine that would maintain the hybrid essence and would debut in 2014, ushering in a completely new and very different era in Formula One. These power units were designed, created and debuted at the Australian Grand Prix in 2014, and the result was general discontent. The power units were not only much more expensive to develop, but they were also
sumamente complejas, ya que tenían numerosos fallos en sus inicios, que
There was quite a bit of discontent among the manufacturers with these technical regulations, especially because these power units also marked the beginning of Mercedes's overwhelming dominance from 2014 to 2020. However, what most destroyed Formula One according to the fans' criticism is that these power units completely killed the sound of Formula One cars, which went from being absolutely deafening to a much less powerful sound. In addition, the cars were slower with these power units compared to the previous generation, and it didn't help that the drivers criticized these new and complex engines for the lack of excitement they generated. Even the boss of Formula One at that time, Bernie Ecclestone, was extremely critical of these power units, saying that this was not Formula One and that these engines were killing the essence of the category. In the end, these technical regulations achieved their goal of making the cars more environmentally sustainable, as they required less fuel and were much faster than the previous generation of engines. But at the time, their implementation generated a wave of massive criticism. In fact, from 2014 to 2017, viewership plummeted. Given the negativity that some fans had regarding these technical regulations, this situation changed drastically with the arrival of the book. But even so, considering what happened to some brands like Renault, and aside from the specific case of Honda, Formula One never managed to attract new manufacturers. In addition, these power units became expensive, complex, and killed the sound. They created a situation that sparked a lot of controversy, and people didn't hesitate to say that this had been a failed technical regulation, quickly becoming the 2014 Power Unit Technical Regulation the fourth place in our top technical regulations, most controversial in the history of Formula One. Ground effect was a major aerodynamic breakthrough in the top category. I'm not talking about the 2022 technical regulation, but about the brilliance developed by the team's brilliant leader, Lotus's Colin Chapman, who was largely the main developer of this concept in Formula One cars during the 1970s. In essence, ground effect as seen in the late 1970s was a discovery in which the Bernoulli principle was applied, which states that when there is an increase in the speed of a fluid, in this case air, the pressure drops, which is reflected in the airflow under the chassis, causing it to stick to the track, practically turning it into a giant four-wheeled wing. And Lotus took advantage of this principle by lowering the cars as close to the ground as possible, while also using aerodynamic skirts on the sides of the cars to maximize ground effect, making these elements in particular quickly become extremely popular features on the Formula One grid due to the technical and aerodynamic advantages they provided, which obviously translated into faster lap times. The grid began experimenting with different aerodynamic elements with the intention of maximizing the strength of ground effect. And one of those experiments was the famous Brabham fan car from 1978. And this aerodynamic exploitation caused a lot of friction between the Formula One team's FISA, which was the predecessor of what we now know as the FIA, and Formula One itself. But with this ground effect and these political clashes between the teams, FISA and Formula One, it was in 1981 that a revolt would come, unleashing one of the biggest scandals in Formula One. Since in 1980, Jean-Marie Balestre, who was the president of FISA at that time, published and presented to the world the technical regulations for the 1981 Formula One season, in which the use of aerodynamic skirts that enhanced ground effect was strictly prohibited and a minimum distance of 6 centimeters between the edges of the car and the ground was required, thus reducing the power of the ground effect, and where the weight of the cars was increased by about 50 kilograms. A measure taken by the president of FISA in an attempt to minimize ground effect, which left private teams at a terrible disadvantage as they were the ones who had exploited this loophole the most. This was obviously against the official teams, the constructors of the category, who saw this as a disadvantage since the private teams used less powerful engines, but thanks to ground effect they could compete against the powerful engines.
¿Qué tenían los equipos constructores?
But what bothered the private teams the most was that supposedly this technical regulation was approved without consulting them and without notifying the teams beforehand. Although the FIA justified not doing so, saying that these changes had been made for safety reasons, as a result of Patrick Depailler's accident during a test session at the Hockenheim circuit in Germany. And this was happening in the middle of the war between FISA and FOCA, where this ban only ended up making the conflict between them even worse. The private teams accused FISA of doing this to favor the constructor teams that had been able to develop their engines more than the aerodynamic elements that were going to be banned in 1981. This hurt them significantly, further escalating the conflict between the organizations. And this obviously forced the private teams to look for new ways to try to get around these regulations, especially the one that required the cars to be raised 6 centimeters higher off the ground,
minimizando el efecto suelo.
So teams like Brabham developed a high-drop pneumatic suspension that allowed the car to lower its height on the track and raise itself once off the track to pass all the technical inspections established by FISA. So the teams were developing alternative measures to get around the controls established by Formula One's own regulatory body, all in the middle of a political war between two vital organizations for Formula One at that time, FISA and FOCA. And seeing how the teams were getting around all these mechanisms, FISA had no choice but to eliminate the controversial rules from the 1981 technical regulations, making it a technical regulation that escalated the war between FISA and FOCA even further. It also left the teams quite upset in a battle that wouldn't end at that moment, but much later on. But what the implementation of that technical regulation meant in the political context of the battle between FISA and FOCA is what makes the 1981 rules stand out as the third most powerful and controversial technical regulation in the history of Formula One. You know, in the history of Formula One, there have been cases where either a team doesn't like the regulations, or where the fans don't like the regulations, or where it's the drivers who don't like a technical regulation. But never, at least in the more than 20 years I've been watching this sport, had I seen the majority of fans, teams, and drivers so unanimously and strongly reject the technical regulation, calling it garbage. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know this story well, and the silver medal in this ranking goes to the technical regulation.
El año 2026.
A technical regulation that everyone knows very well by now, and that we've explained thoroughly on this channel in several videos. But for some quick context, in an attempt to attract new manufacturers and avoid losing the existing ones, in the year 2022, the new technical regulation for Formula One power units was approved, in which these power units would now become more important. In the energy section, these hybrid power units would now have a 50-50 split between combustion and electric power. A regulation that, on paper, looked perfect for attracting brands, and that's what made Audi enter the category and kept Honda from leaving Formula One. However, from the conception of this regulation, there were already doubts that the way of regenerating energy would not be enough to maintain the power levels required by Formula One cars. But in this case, FOM itself and the International Automobile Federation didn't pay attention to these early warnings that the drivers were starting to give. And so, this technical regulation was conceived in the year 2026. When it was introduced, all the warned about problems became reality. Suddenly, since the energy quotas that needed to be deployed were high and the cars didn't have the storage or recovery capacity. This has given us a Formula One where management has reached levels never seen before in the sport, where the drivers have to manage during qualifying, in the race, when overtaking, when defending, and so on and so on. And that has led to a huge part of both drivers and fans, as well as some teams on the grid, complaining about this technical regulation that have put Formula One in a situation not seen in many years in the category. Well, the speed differentials between single-seaters have become quite dangerous, as shown by a serious accident like the one Oliver Burman had at the Japanese Grand Prix. Formula One has become a management game taken to extreme levels, and many fans claim that these technical regulations have made Formula One races quite artificial. This has caused conflicts where the series asks drivers to soften their criticism of regulations, and where several fans have accused Formula One itself of censoring them in an attempt to cover up a technical regulation that is very controversial, both because of the way these cars are now driven and because of the artificiality of the show, which has become much more noticeable in these last races. As I said, Formula One has created a technical regulation that has made the criticism almost unanimous. This has brought Formula One to a rare state of tension, especially in April, after failing to hold the Bahrain and Saudi Arabia Grand Prix. Formula One had to take emergency measures to try to solve the problems that were affecting the drivers and fans of Formula One. So in second place, and the silver medal in this particular ranking, is the 2026 Power Unit Regulations. We all know that in 1994 we saw one of the most controversial and darkest seasons in the history of Formula One, but what would you say if I told you that this was largely caused by the technical regulations that were implemented that season? Alright, before 1994, electronic aids like active suspension, traction control, launch control, anti-lock brakes, and many others were allowed. They took Formula One by surprise and quickly became very popular among the teams that were starting to develop their cars. But in the eyes of several fans and some drivers on the grid, back then, drivers were pushed completely into the background. As these devices became more relevant, generating excessive dependence, Max Mosley became president of the FIA in 1993. And one of his proposals was to put the focus back on the driver so that they could become heroes again, which led to a decision being made in 1993 that, without knowing it, would damage the image of Formula One in the eyes of the world like never before. And in order to put the focus back on the driver, the decision was made to eliminate each and every one of the electronic aids that had become so popular in the early 1990s. The issue is that only these aids were removed, while the car's structural design stayed the same. The main problem is these single-seaters were built for electronic aids, and removing them abruptly, without any structural changes,
Fórmula 1 iba a volver la categoría mucho más peligrosa.
That was the complaint that several drivers had back then, that the cars were stupidly fast, but now, without the electronic aids, they were going to be stupidly dangerous, and unfortunately, Formula One had to find that out in the worst possible way. Just 3 races after the start of the 1994 Formula One World Championship, the worst predictions ended up coming true. The cars were extremely dangerous, and Barrichello nearly died during practice at that San Marino Grand Prix. But later, Roland Ratzenberger lost his life when he crashed his car at the Villeneuve corner, and afterwards, Ayrton Senna. Da Silva, one of the biggest superstars in Formula One, also ended up losing his life when he crashed his car at the Tamburello corner on race day, which ended up confirming that these cars without electronic aids were extremely dangerous. And the category had another scare when, weeks later at the Monaco Grand Prix, the German driver Karl Wendick crashed on the Monaco circuit and his accident left him in a coma for several days. This forced the FIA to react urgently and try to patch up the current cars until they could make structural changes that couldn't be done in 1994 and would have to wait until 1995. Some changes were made to certain profiles of the cars, and, as an emergency measure, improvised chicanes had to be introduced in some of the fastest corners on the Formula One calendar, which could be potentially dangerous for the cars of that 1994 season. Necessary changes in response to a technical regulation that turned out to be potentially dangerous, as shown by 2 very serious accidents and involving 2 drivers. Without electronic aids. The technical regulations of 1994 are the most controversial in history because, due to this and its complete lack of foresight regarding safety, the category had to experience firsthand the loss of 2 drivers in the worst possible ways. All this happened under a completely flawed regulation, in which the dangerous nature of the changes was clearly not studied, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. And under a regulation that resulted in 4 serious accidents, 2 drivers dead, and Formula One being forced to make provisional and drastic changes. That 1994 season, and all the scandal around what happened that year, is why it takes the #1 spot. And the top spot goes to the most controversial technical regulation in the history of Formula One, the one from 1994, which limited electronic aids in Formula One cars. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the top 5 most controversial technical regulations in Formula One history. But this is where I ask you, do you think any other technical regulation should have made it onto this list? Did you know the story behind any of them, or did you get to experience any of those eras? Let me know all your opinions in the comments section. That's all from me. I'll say goodbye now. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications so you know when I'm uploading a new video, and share this with your friends. Also, I invite you to follow us on our Instagram and Twitter accounts. The links will be in the description of this video, and I'll see you soon for more content here on Skyline Racing. Thank you for tuning in and see you later.